I'm Chris Cook. If you've just watched me, you might find it slightly surreal. I'm reintroducing myself. I'm a contributing editor here at Tortoise. For our next session on Education Summit, we have what is a fairly large question to get through in 50 minutes. Have we lost sight of education's purpose? This is a thinking in partnership with BigChange, who are running a big education conversation about the future of education. We will put a link to their excellent website in the chat. I strongly advise you to go and play with their very pretty and very interesting and interactive evidence gathering process. The big picture about English education in particular at the moment is we built an incredibly sort of complicated system. We have exams and assessments and league tables that are designed to basically make the system do a certain amount of stuff for every child. We're supposed to be driving up standards for everyone. But actually one of the questions we've really got to sort of pose at this point is whether the fact that we can produce it like a set of outputs through a set of exams and we can make sure every school does it, is that a good reason to do it? Have we put the administrative cart before the horse? And I've got a really wonderful panel to talk about this with. We have Alex Goat, who's the chief executive of Livity, which is a company that is engaged in helping young creative people and young creative employers meet one another and work out what each other needs. We have Aliyah Irabor-York, who's the founder of the Pupil Power, which is I guess it's simplest to say, a sort of pupil voice advocacy group attempted to get young people heard. And we have Tierney, who is a chair of the Headteachers Roundtable and now former head teacher himself. But Stephen is a long-standing voice within the profession. I was wondering if we could start with Aliyah, really, because I think one of the fundamental questions in all of this is really whether what pupils sort of feel they need is responded to by the system, and whether you feel like how much of your time, at the end of your sort of education journey, you find yourself thinking, why have I done this? What is the point of this? And whether you're getting what you think you need from the system.
I mean, where do I even start? There's so much to unpack from that question.
In three minutes,
I think there's no doubt in saying that there's a problem in education, but most fundamentally, the biggest problem is that we don't actually understand to the fullest extent what education is for. And even if we do have an idea in our head, from my personal opinion, as a student who's just finished their A-levels, I would always say that education and my school experience has been set up to prepare me for life. But whether that is actually fulfilled in reality is a different question. And I think a lot of young people would disagree and say that it's not fulfilled, unfortunately. We go to school and we are made to feel really passive in the sense that we're taught how to learn, when to learn. Lights have kind of turned off. But we're taught how to learn, when to learn, and are not really taught those critical thinking skills or the skills that employers actually are looking for when you enter the big wide world of employment and work or whatever you do want to go on to do. So in regards to us as young people, I just would always go back to saying it's so important that we do have that bottom-up approach, as you were speaking about earlier, because when we have young people that are at the bottom and the parents who are going through that system, then we can actually help influence the environment and the learning space that we want and that's best suited for us, rather than assuming that what we have is actually beneficial and working.
Can I ask, Elliot, what your if there are like particular people or interests you've kind of got in mind about whether who it's not working for, like when you look around you and your friends as well, who are the people who you feel aren't sort of served by tell me if I think I'm wrong, right? But my impression is always schools in England are pretty well run for nerdy kids who want to go to university and definitely want to do that, and then they will think about their what they want to do afterwards. We sort of understand that. And it's everyone else. I always feel like we don't.
Exactly. I honestly feel as if those that don't fit that quota of those that want to go to Oxbridge or university, they're seen as failures and almost seen as like a waste of resource and time and energy, which is honestly disheartening to hear as a young person, or to feel even. And I'm sure teachers listening would probably think like that's not what they want us to feel. It's what the system kind of makes us feel. And so, and also like the most marginalized students from ethnic minority backgrounds rather, when we look at exclusion rates, and just simply how the system is just a one size fits all, and it shouldn't be that way. It very much feels like if you don't suit it, then you're out, or you struggle along, and then you get to the end of it and realize that it wasn't actually working for you.
Do you have friends or you yourself who sort of don't know how to progress, or and do you have
absolutely?
So what happened? How does it sort of express itself? What happens?
So I think a big part of it is we express it in different ways, and so whether it is being destructive or doing our own thing, or in the teacher's eyes like rebelling against lessons, those are forms of like disengagement. And that isn't because you wake up one day and decide that you just want to do it for fun. It's just because you realize that the system isn't working for you. And so it happens in so many different forms. And I think right now at the stage that I'm at, where university is seen as the right next big step that you're meant to take, I've realized it. A lot of young people around me, my own peers, are like saying, I don't want to go to uni, and teachers saying you need to apply because they want to get that percentage and that stat on their website of how many people they're shipping off to university. Luckily, I would say I love learning and I want to progress onto university, and so that's for me, but it's not for everybody, and that's what the big problem is.
Okay, thanks ever so. I think we'll go on to Alex. We'll come back to you, Aliyah, but we'll go to Alex from Livity. Alex, can you just briefly? I tried to give you a brief explanation of your role in the world.
No, of course. Yeah, so Livity, in a nutshell, we're a creative business that work hand in hand with organisations and young people to build a better future. So for 20 years, we've been working directly with young people. We're proudly based in South London in Brixton, but work across the country. So work with a very diverse group of young people, all with a kind of creative mindset and a desire to improve the world in some way, but work with large organisations to help really bridge that gap between what the world of work needs from the next generation coming out of school, and also what young people need and want for their own kind of careers and career development. So I guess I'm wearing a kind of two hats here. One, the work that we do directly with young people, but also I guess an understanding of some of the opportunities and the limitations, I guess, from an employment point of view.
Do you think that I'm intrigued by what you do and how you're brokering almost of employees and young people, but I think do you feel like there's a particular problem with the creative sector about what schools are preparing?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I kind of come at it like, I mean, I don't think it's, it's interesting because the kind of the exam question here, like, has education, in terms of its purpose. And I think, like, for me, I think that if you kind of asked any of us, even the four of us discussing on this panel today, whether we had a clearly defined understanding of education's purpose, and if we do, are we aligned on it? I would say the answer is probably no to both of those. I certainly don't think education's purpose is solely to prepare young people for the world of work. However, I do think when I think about, my view of what education's purpose should be, based on my experience and my values, the things which I think we see, kind of the needs from young people and the needs from industry, critical thinking, curiosity, confidence, I definitely think that those are, in the best case scenarios, that's what young people leave with, but that's certainly not the case across the board.
Right. Thanks ever so much, Alex. I don't know if we could come now to Stephen Tierney. Stephen you're a head teacher and you're now a consultant at Leading Learner. And you were the head of a Catholic multi-academy trust in the north of England with both primary and secondary schools in it. And you saw our conversation, I think, with Tom, and you've heard what Alex and Aliyah were just saying then. Do you think there's a sort of implementation question that we need to be thinking about when we talk about this? That is to say, how much of what we do at the moment is because we think it's sort of administratively kind of deliverable? We know how to do a maths GCSE. We don't really know how to do a creative arts GCSE that we trust as much.
I think it's partly about deliverability, but it's also partly about history. It's kind of like what we've done and the reasons for it. And I think that there's not just a deliverability issue, there's the deeper purpose issue. So if we kind of look at kind of current trends, say curriculum trends, there's a very strong move towards looking at things around cultural transmission. So that might fall into two things, partly cultural literacy or all kind of generations of time and across cultures have wanted to share, if you like, the best they've thought and said with the new generation. There's also the subject work, which is very, very strong in schools at the minute. What we're seeing less of in terms of education, I think, is work around personal empowerment to an extent, which has been picked up in part. We're seeing less about preparation of people for work, and we're seeing far less about preparation for people for citizenship and work within communities. And so we've become, I think, a move towards a very strong intellectual purpose within school, but we've started to miss some of the balance and the relevance issues across schools. And these aren't either ors. These are kind of four things that you're desperately trying to hold in tension. And the question is whether we've got the tension right. And part of the reason we do GCSEs is because we used to do O-levels, because at one point we used to leave school at 16. Everybody's smiling and thinking, what are O-levels? I did O-levels. They were like the thing before GCSEs. And it was partly because we used to leave school at 16 and there was some kind of matriculation. We wanted to kind of know where people were up to. And so they could kind of signpost them in. But the system has been built from going back hundreds of years and is now aimed towards what people have already said, which is kind of a university entrance. And you know, quite interesting to think about whether the whole process there. And Ken Robinson used to take the mickey saying it's a 13-year application for university, basically education.
I think that's one of the things I always feel like I have to sort of I feel like it's a cheap thing I can continue to remind people of, and it continually shocks them. So when my dad went to university, when he went to school, when he started school, there was no compulsory secondary school. My mother was later a teacher. When she first left university, she wouldn't have needed a degree to become a teacher. Most kids didn't take any, what we would now recognize as recognized qualifications until the 1980s. We didn't really inspect schools until the 1990s in a sort of meaningful way. The extent to which we kind of don't have there's not like a nice, better past, right? We've always had problems and have always been increasing the volumes of education we're delivering. But as you say, we built it on the tracks that used to exist that led to a small minority of people going to university. Do you see what I mean? Is that a fair?
Yeah, if you kind of look at the evolution over the past 500 years, you're essentially looking at some of the kind of particularly well-known now independent colleges, and it was about preparation in the liberal arts curriculum towards a kind of a university style study. And in some ways, we're still locked in that system. And a lot of the kind of the qualifications and the accreditations we have are geared towards that. And so if you like, if we're going to think about the system, it's thinking about kind of what kind of accreditation, but it's going back to purpose. Why are we educating? If you like, what's the telos? What's the end point? And so my two penny with it's about a life well lived. How do we ensure every young person across the country has a life well lived, and schools contribute to that as part and parcel?
I was wondering, thank you ever so much, Stephen. I was wondering if we could just put the slides that we prepared. My colleague Phoebe is going to work some magic. So that I was just going to quickly whisk through these because some of these numbers are a bit counterintuitive, but I think are really fascinating. So one of the things that's interesting about England in particular is not so much that we have a lot of testing, is that the testing is very frightening because it feels very high stakes, you know, GCSEs and A-levels, and even before that with SATs, that kids feel really intensely about it. And you can see that in the numbers on how even kids who are doing well at school feel incredibly stressed about testing. If we go on to the next one, there's one of the things I also thought was striking. We talk a lot about anxiety for young people, and actually the extent to which exam stress and work stress and school stress is a bigger thing than, for example, bullying or eating disorders, despite the fact that, you know, it isn't really reflected in our conversations. If we move on. This is a set of polling that sort of asks people, given that if things were to change, where would you change them? One of the things I thought was really striking from the answers we got from both teachers and parents was they roughly agree about what the issues are. So there's a lot of people who think that exam system, that the stress we just talked about, is a problem. There's actually, I was quite surprised that there's relatively little concern about the curriculum, but maybe that's a foible of the questioning. I was also struck by the fact that making the exam system work for the disadvantaged is a big factor for both. If we move on to the next one, one of the things that's sort of striking is that we've had a lot of pressure placed on young people over the last 15 years, and actually you can't really see an improvement in results. We could have put in lines for maths and for science, and actually would have been a pretty similar result. We haven't really seen a significant shift. If we go on to the last one though, this is basically a piece of research I put into every presentation I ever give on education, because it's fascinating, where basically the researchers tried to work out, given how much of the social mobility problem is caused by the fact that schools are basically stuffing poor kids. And the answer in Britain is actually our schools are pretty good. It's everything else that's the problem. So the kids who turn up for interviews at brown shoes at posh law firms and then get turned away because they don't understand the niceties of these things. That's the sort of where our problem is as a country. Our school system is pretty good. The problem we got, I think, and the thing we have to sort of work out a solution to in the next half hour, is the fact that this has kind of this is the flip side of the stress, right? The fact that we get kids qualifications that let them progress a little better than in other countries has come at the cost of, we can put the slides down after, has come at the cost of this incredible stress. And I think there's narrowing too. Aliyah, I wonder if I could come to you on, I think the one of the things I think is tough is whether young people feel they're getting a fair shake, basically, and whether if you get rid of the high intensity stress, it will be easier basically for rich kids to game the system. Do you feel exams are fair? Like when you go into an exam, do you think, well, you know what, I'm doing the same exam as the kid from Eton, or do you think, oh, like it's gamed against me?
I think there's a combination of feelings. I think at first, especially with like now my official A-level exams being cancelled, a lot of us were feeling like exams were the only ways in order to fairly be assessed and get into where we wanted to go next. The way in which we are assessed obviously then contributes to whether we find assessments fair or not. I think the overall type of assessment in regards to what feels like a memory test is what I have an issue with. So it's like you're cramming in so much information in 2 years, and then you have that one massive exam, and then oh no, I didn't remember that sociologist's name. I know it, but didn't remember it on the 14th of June. Now you get a B and you're not worthy of an A. And that's what I have an issue of. And my teachers can really believe in me and know, not even believe in me, actually know and have the evidence from previous assessments, but because it wasn't that one exam on that one day, it's no good. And I think that's why it's interesting now when we have these conversations, we're learning so much about ways in which we can assess moving forward, because schools were doing things differently. They actually were given a little bit more responsibility, arguably, by the government, and was being told, do what's best for your students. And so content was cut down a little bit, and then teachers were assessing us in ways which were, best suited for us because they know us best. So I think there is a problem with the assessment type, and there's definitely ways in which we can make it fairer.
Can I ask, from your perspective, and do you think that we talked a bit before about the system's quite good for some sorts of kids, but not for others? Do you think so you said there you've got concerns about the exam system and how you do on one day being the fundamental test of your whole life, but also do you think the kinds of things you're learning are the wrong things? Do you find yourself thinking, why haven't I been offered this, or why is this the normal thing for people to do? Are there things you look at from other schools where you think actually we should be doing that?
Absolutely. To be honest, to actually answer that second part of the question, I haven't actually seen a model of a curriculum that I would say we need to learn in that way, which I think is the concerning point, right? I haven't actually witnessed or experienced a curriculum that I feel like would be amazing for me to learn. As a young person, and again, my peers, and even conversations as activists and change makers, we're always talking about the curriculum. That's a massive factor in it. It's very narrow. It's very also jam-packed at the same time. And we feel like we're learning things that aren't so relevant. At the same time, it's if you look at like humanities in terms of the perspectives that we're taught from, it's very ethnocentric. And if you like history and geography, like even I saw a tweet earlier, and the A-level / GCSE content page on like climate change, they just said fossil fuels are bad. And that's as far as it went down into. And so when we talk about, you know, wanting to have leaders of the future and active citizenship, our curriculum is where we start. If we actually are aware of the issues that are going on, that would play a massive role in, you know, reshaping our society and making the world a better place.
So I'm not going to ask you this now, Aliyah, but we'll come back to you with an answer to this question, which I'm about to put to Stephen, I think, which is, if you could change the curriculum to add or take away 5 things, say, this is going to come to Stephen first, but we'll come back to you, Aliyah. This is the, what would they be? What do you think we need to add, Stephen, and what do you think we need to take away?
Can I just do, and I'm not dodging that question, but just the fair exams, because I'd go yes and no. There's a danger that we fall into exams are fair because at the same time, on the same day, pupils get asked the same questions, which has a fairness about it, tick, and forget the 18 years that went before that led them up to the point of walking in the exam room, where the gross unfairness comes from. But I think you said it before, Chris, when you were chatting, and the most difficult question with respect to education is not what you're going to add. Everybody's got something to add. It's what you're going to take away. And there's a fascinating blog by somebody called Solomon Kingsnorth. I don't know whether you've ever read it, but he looks at Estonia, and Estonia's performance in maths is far closer to Pacific Rim countries than the English system. And the English system is basically, it's good, but it's stuck and it's beginning to look fragile. And what he was saying is that the Estonia curriculum for maths, the equivalent of GCSE, is 1/5 the size of the English. And so what Estonia have done is they've identified which elements of maths are really important for pupils to encounter, to know, and to understand, and then be able to apply to understand maths. And what we've done is we've gone for this kind of content fetish where learning knowledge is a good thing. So actually, if we learn loads more, it's a great thing.
Right.
And Dylan Williams, if you know Professor Dylan Williams or have heard of him, talks about the amount or a content-heavy curriculum as being immoral. And what he says is you reach a point where there is so much content that the majority of pupils can't learn it quickly enough. And so what you do as a teacher is you just go faster and faster and faster, and pupils encounter it, that we did this, but they haven't had time to really learn it. And so instead of going for specific things, I'd say we almost need to look at all of our curriculum and say,
slice it down.
Sorry?
Salami slice it down, just reduce the amount of content and lots of things.
And that means we've got to identify the really important, if you like, concepts, the underpinning ideas, the things that you can build around to create space. And then certainly there's things like the EBAC. I'm not a fan. It's a certain group of subjects which are no more valuable in reality to people's lives, I would argue, apart from English, maths and science, but then I was a head of science. Right. Than many other subjects, and we're losing some of the creative subjects, we're losing some of the physical education subjects, and we're not creating the space for the balance where we'd look at the creativity, the emotional development, the spiritual and moral development of young people. And so I think we create space not by, if you like, taking out subjects, but looking at them differently. And the other thing I think we've got to do is we've got to give some space for what I describe as pupils to think but act.
Can I ask, do you think that's what I find sort of surprising, that you I think, because you put people in boxes in your head, and I think did you think when you are made czar and you are allowed to do what you like, do you think that we would have a very similar sort of school day, but where teachers are teaching the same sort of subjects, but there'll be slightly less content to each of them in the hope of getting better understanding because you'll have a condensed curriculum? Is that?
I think there'd be significantly less content. So in other words, we've got to get the content that's got the right level of challenge, the right amount of content, and the right time. Those are the kind of the three that you've got to play with so that the vast majority of pupils can master the subjects. But we also need to create space. So something that I was a particular fan of, Duke of Edinburgh.
Right.
I think that's a great experience for young people. Why are we not having all young people able to experience Duke of Edinburgh or something akin to it? and those kind of experiences.
I mean, I'm pushing you slightly on this because I thought it's an interesting sort of conceptual question that you think, so we could have a little less time in the future, the Stephen Tierney empire, you have roughly the same sorts of lengths of lessons, say, during the day, with more condensed content, but freeing up a little bit of extra time for things like the Duke of Edinburgh and other creative, non-examy, soft skill building experiences.
Yeah, I need to kind of pick up some of the detail of that. But you're talking in round cases, yes, we've kind of become a very intellectual system. And that's not to say that the intellectual isn't important. It is. The idea that schools don't help pupils to get cleverer seems slightly daft to me. But if we haven't got it in kilter with pupils also in terms of their emotional well-being, their mental health, and, you know, just the stats that you showed. But if you look at the 2018 PISA data for 15-year-olds and their life satisfaction, England was 69th out of 72. Right. Our young people are telling us they're really unhappy, and they've consistently told us for a long time. And the system isn't responding to look at that and say, okay, so how might this start to play out? And there's also opportunities, you know, when I look at, I was in Blackpool where I was a head teacher, and there's things called lower layer super output areas. There's 35,000 across England and Wales. If you rank them from most affluent to least affluent, and you looked at the bottom 10, 8 of them were in Blackpool. Right. Blackpool is off the scale in terms of disadvantage. Schools can't do it all. No. There needs to be other things. Chris.
Thanks ever so much, Steve. Can we come to Alex next, actually? And basically so I basically have the same question for you, really. When you are made empress and are allowed to dictate what schools do, what do you think we should be doing differently? And do you think there are things we should, you know, when you meet these young people who you're trying to sort of place through, what are the things that they're missing that they need? And yeah.
I wish I could have a very different answer to really pull this apart than Stephen's, but I'm afraid I would agree very, very much with kind of his perspective. I think certainly I think it's for us, you know, what we see so much, you know, there's so much positivity with young people that are coming out of school and thinking about the world of work. Their ambition and entrepreneurial skills. I mean, mental health and the anxiety that the education system has put on them in the last few years, certainly their education, I think, is totally unrealistic. And so that point of giving the breadth of opportunity to learn across different passion points, I think, is really important. But there just seems like such a volume of content. There isn't that ability to critically assess and critically think and critically, you know, give your perspective on the content that you're learning. It is just volume. And I think, you know, that's one of the things that those of us who, you know, are lucky to go to university, there is that space to be able to think about the things that you're learning and understand where they fit in the wider world. And, you know, when I think about the skills, as I say, whether that is the skills that, you know, as a parent and as somebody who's engaged in youth engagement, or as somebody who thinks about the world of employment, as I say, critical thinking, curiosity, confidence, those are the kind of things which I think are so important, but there's no room for those. And so I would wholeheartedly agree that an opportunity to take out some of the volume of that content, but to give young people the breadth of opportunity to think about the subjects which actually really matter to them, I would agree.
Can I ask, is there anything you've encountered when you're dealing with young people where you think, kids who've done this course, they're great, and I know that they all have great problem solving? Like, are there things you can point to that will help us sort of say, that's a really...
I also, I mean, I've done some work with DV. I think that is, I think that's really great. I do think, like, we do quite a lot of work with the PHSE Association, and there are, I mean, I have so much respect for any teacher in the world right now, the volume of which they're trying to teach and the logistics, and then thinking about those other kind of skills. But I do think we see like a wealth of really interesting resources which are being created by people who are not purely in the education space, which I think are aimed to foster some of that. Like, for example, we work with a charity called Bike Back 2030, which is about, you know, changing the food system forever, and actually an opportunity to get young people kind of thinking and campaigning in that space. But it has to be outside, unfortunately, outside of the the very, very packed day. So I think there are really interesting programs, and there are people who, whether it's kind of issue specific or not, are looking at helping young people engage in their communities, engage in that opportunity for them to think about their own sort of selves and their own agency, I think are really important. So I think there are, in that case, opportunities to do that, and I just wish there was probably more time in the school curriculum, because I do know that, you know, speaking to lots of teachers, they wish they could do more of it, but there's just no time.
Okay, thanks ever so much. Aliyah, now so what from your experience, what do you think we do too much of, and what do you think we need to do more of? How would you restructure the system?
So at Pupil Power, so my role, I'm not only a student, I run Pupil Power, which is a youth-led movement, and our biggest aim is to reimagine education. And so, as you can imagine, we're a national movement, and young people are coming from different parts of the country with different backgrounds and lived experiences. And so everybody has their own, you know, this is what I want to change. For me as an individual, I would always say making education more democratic. And that includes involving young people through every step of the way. Key decision making. Why are young people at the table with senior leaders? I don't know if there's senior leaders on this call right now that might feel uncomfortable at that thought, but I would highly encourage it. It was something that I used to push for as head girl at my secondary, and it worked really well when we had, you know, young people at the table in governor meetings and things like that. And that is a way in which we can make sure that we are getting happier students in school, because we're catering and making sure that their concerns are at the forefront. Another huge thing, I just personally think that when we make education democratic and we're centering youth voice, then a lot of the problems can be solved, because we're being listened to, and it needs to happen in a genuine way, not tokenistic either.
So I guess that's it. So you've gone straight past my question to like a structural solution, which is, if we make the decision making democratic, we kind of don't need to have this conversation, because pupils will be empowered to push for what they feel they need for. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's, again, I just think it sounds so easy, right? Even me being in this space right now, I'm not sure how many times we've had a young person on a panel like this before. This is a huge step. Having young people involved in the conversation and making sure that they're included, and BigChange does that throughout all the work they're doing, which is what more organisations definitely need to take on board.
Shall I be a contrary old person at you?
Yes, please. Go for it.
So I once went to an event in Wolverhampton, and one of the talking about schools, and one of the council officials turned up to this event, and they said basically, trust me, like, kids in Wolverhampton, they're not, you know, most of them aren't really university kids, and like, it was incredibly sort of dismissive, and they're basically making excuses for some problems in their local schools. And I'd always worry about, like, you do get little areas where you get like cultures of sort of low expectations, and people get used to the idea of things not going well. So actually, in a set, there are places where you kind of need someone to say, this isn't good enough. This town needs to do better. Do you think that's that stuff is hard to do while respecting, if you like, the democratic process on the ground, right?
Yeah, I mean, some of those things that you just mentioned are my own lived experience. I just finished school, but based in East London. And so from primary, secondary and sixth form have been based in East London. And some of the schools I've been to have, you know, probably had low expectations. And so I think it is really difficult, because as somebody that is in that environment, I'm always like, well, if they can, why can't we? And it is really, really sad if teachers and school leaders kind of have that at the forefront of their mind. Like, again, I moved to sixth form because I didn't like my previous sixth form, and as soon as I entered, my head of the member of staff didn't actually like know me, and the first thing he said is that I shouldn't be applying for Oxbridge, and he disencouraged loads of students to not apply, and I, you know, stuck to my guns, and I did apply, and I was the only one that actually got an offer. So things like that is really, really problematic, because education, the school environment, we're meant to be showing young people that, you know, the world's our oyster, and that we can, you know, what's the problem in failing? I think the system actually disencourages failure, and I think that's a really important thing that we all need to learn. There's no problem in everybody applying and trying. And so, yeah, just going back to your question, I think there's room for both. I think we can definitely make sure that it's democratic, even if there's low expectations. And I think also going back on that, young people, if they actually try it, then they start to realize that, yeah, for example, because they're made to feel passive, they don't get involved in citizenship or, you know, activism and things like that, because they're like, nothing's going to change. But when they do, they're like, oh wow, like look at the power of my voice. So it's, yeah, I think we need to encourage it more.
Good, thanks ever so much, Aliyah. Can we go to Ellie Costello, whose camera has just switched off? There you're back. Hello.
Hi, I'm here.
You've picked me up for using the expression soft skills, among other things.
Yeah. Sorry.
That's right.
I was, yeah.
Can I ask,
yeah.
by the way, can I ask who you are in a sort of fundamental sense?
Yeah. So I'm first and foremost, I guess, this journey where I've got to is because I'm a mum to 2 children with complex needs spanning health, social care, education and mental health needs. We're that family that failed the system, although arguably the system failed us, systems. But I'm a director of a kit called Square Peg, and we work to raise awareness and affect change for the almost 1 million children who are marked as persistent absentees within education or outside education. And of course, more and more children and families are being pushed to the margins and are square pegs. As the system has become narrower, there are less round holes and more square pegs. So yeah, that's us. So
you apart from telling me off, soft skills are very important. We just don't have good words for them. I
think we need to get really alive to the fact, because it's so easy when we're trying to speak truth to power. It's very easy with the narrative out of the DFE and our behaviours are that these skills are unimportant and a little bit fluffy and a little bit silly. And actually they are essential. These are the essential foundations that are going to give us, you know, positive population health. And the only thing that I think they'll listen to is if we don't want an adult population that's remaining within mental health care, and unable to pay their taxes and function and dying of diabetes, etc., then we need to start really promoting emotional literacy, supporting our children and our workforce to, you know, get alive with all the feels, and that is how we are then able to settle, regulate to learn, and be able to learn and reach our potential.
I really feel like a lot of the conversations that we've been having, the conversation with you just now, Ellie, and also with Tom, I don't know if you saw Tom Fletcher just before on assessment. It feels like there's a lot of sort of Montessori-ness in the background of some of this stuff. In the, you know, the Montessori system has a reputation for being hippie-ish, but actually it's a lot about self-regulation and a lot about self-possession and understanding and putting that above other skills.
But it's only possible. Self-regulation isn't actually possible in a child under 25. So they actively rely and need on co-regulation in order to be able to settle, to learn and manage their emotions and learn from modelling. But the reason, ironically, my children were blissfully happy in a Montessori nursery before they ended up within a mainstream setting and crashed and burned spectacularly.
Didn't set this up. We should tell you that.
And in fact, I forget that we started off in Montessori world, and it was, you know, we entered primary education during the Gove reforms, and yeah, the primary education changed overnight within the school year. The thing about, again, Montessori is that it's tapping into what Aliyah was saying, is that it is that self-directed, interest-led. You know, children, there's a research paper, I wish I knew who it was from, but it said that children, there's some attainment level, but when they're with a teacher that they know likes them, they perform better, they get better exam results and all the rest of it. So I think it's about prioritizing good relationships, connection, knowing how to actually recover connection when it's lost. How do we disagree well? How do we spot what's going on in ourselves so that we know how we're reacting with each other? And that goes for supporting teachers to support children, all of that. It's essential. It's essential. We've got to get much more fundamentally down with the feels in order to be able to cognitively be able to access the curriculum, however that may look.
That's very, thanks ever so much, Ellie. I was wondering if we could come to Lucy Bailey. because Lucy said something that actually cuts to the point about something I've repeatedly raised, which is can you assess these other things? Like, I mean, we came up with Tom coming up this time. Fundamentally, I don't believe we will ever have a school system that will take what I'm not supposed to call soft skills, Ellie, take cognitive development, self-possession, self-regulation seriously if we can't measure it.
Yeah, so thank you so much for inviting me on, because we at Bounce Forward, so a national charity, that we describe ourselves as specialist in practical resilience training for schools. Already there is a debate about what resilience means. For us, resilience is a very specific set of skills and competencies that you can teach, you can measure, and you can master. And all the things that we've been talking about. We've actually just come out of the back of a randomised controlled trial that tracked 11,000 students from 35 schools across the country, all different types of schools, whether that's state schools, independent schools, schools that were in special measures. We tracked the students for 5 years. It's a very, very well-funded project through the Education Endowment Foundation, researched on the health and psychological outcomes by the London School of Economics researchers, and we looked at academic attainment, and that was led by NICE, the National Institute of Social and Economic Research. So a very, well-funded project. What we did in that project was teach healthy minds once a week by trained teachers who, like Aliyah was saying, who, by the way, is an absolute inspiration. She should absolutely be on any conversation we have about what education needs in the future. So well done for you. But, that idea about developing relationships in the classroom, learning the skills and strategies. So the key 5 competencies that underpin the Healthy Minds curriculum, and we also talk about social media and the blurring of boundaries between online and offline. We talk about relationships, sex education, drug education. It was the conceptual framework for the curriculum was based on adolescent development, psychological development, the PSHE Association framework back in 2012 when we designed it. But we are creating competencies, so life skills around flexible and realistic thinking, human connection, and the willingness to connect and reach out with other people, and how to do it. Because human connection is great, but you've got to have the words and the vocabulary to be able to do it. Hope and optimism, teaching these things with learning outcomes in lessons, self-regulation, which Ellie was just talking very passionately about, and self-awareness and compassion.
Can I ask, when you talk about assessing it, so you said that teaching this stuff leads to, you found, to better outcomes, across the board. Right.
Health outcomes, psychological outcomes, behavioural outcomes, yeah.
So do you think that there's, I guess the question really is, do you think that if you do this stuff properly, it will lead to kids getting better grades in conventional subjects? Or do you, in your head, do we think you're moving to a model where we would kind of get grades in these psychological behavioural things?
So unfortunately, Chris, due to COVID, we're actually still waiting on the academic outcomes. So we already have the outcomes on the other side. I absolutely hope so. Even if it's 0, there was because the argument then is we can take one lesson away from these, subjects that are so important to us. And, so it works in a traditional setting, there is no competition between, academic attainment and this sort of teaching and learning. However, I don't actually think that is an argument to keep it and do it in this way, because I actually think that, someone said earlier about maths. Great mathematicians are fantastic problem solvers. It's not necessarily the subjects, it's the way in which we teach. I think mainly what we're trying to do in schools, and certainly people like, the DFE and consultants that are linked to the DFE, it's about kids behaving, sitting down, being quiet and doing as they're told and listening to how do you learn if you're not engaging in a conversation and you're not asking a question and you're not getting enthusiastic about it? So and I don't blame teachers on this at all, because if you look at how teachers are trained to teach, They aren't taught anything about child development or psychological development or what's happening in the teenage brain, which are actually all really important if we are going to, you know, refocus education in a way which is going to help young people for the future. They've got to be agile and they've got to be agents of change.
Thanks ever so much, Lucy. I was wondering if we could come to Akuyemi. You'll have to be our last guest before we wrap up. Akuyemi.
Yes, hello.
Hello.
Thank you for
Raise your
having me.
hand.
Hi. So yes, in my view, we have a system that needs to hear the stories of young people, and of course to hear the stories of students and their own experiences. Unfortunately, we're living in a world that's very systematic and robotized, and unfortunately, I think there's a big you could say picture on universities when universities are not funded as the best as they could be, and also in the fact that within previous education reforms, special educational needs always seem to be left behind. So I am a campaigner of the clause SEN law and believe that we need to produce productivity and constructive investment within these areas, and also the importance of making action and reform that's going to be productive, to not continue constant stories that people and families have faced due to failings within the education system.
Right. Do you think, and did you say it was families who face special educational needs in particular that you feel are let down by the current structures?
Yes, because they are quite, you could say it's a factor that we have an issue where it's pictured in a certain way of educating students. However, it's not really having the support that it requires, and it's not also having the funding there, and parents are not really being listened to as much as they could, in the fact that they have to face issues within making sure that their students are being funded, and also in the importance that there's continuous, you could say, continuous consistency within the education instead of interruptions. And also on the point of court systems as well, they unfortunately have some corruption within, like for the placements, and these are the issues that have been there for years but have not been looked at, and of course just go as another statistic and also another case that doesn't really get prioritized. So education needs to be about education other than having other parts or factors included within education.
Right, right. Thank you ever so much, Akuyemi. I think we've actually run out of time. I will ask, because I'm in charge. I'm going to ask Stephen, Aliyah, and Alex to come out briefly, because I'm already in trouble, one more time. And just, I think the thing I'm sort of keen for us to sort of get to is a sense of what we agree on, and what we think the big takeaway that if you want people to take one thing away from all of this, what is it? So Stephen, what's your 30-second fix to all the problems in education?
I think what I've talked about, what I've heard a lot of, is rebalancing. So there's various aspects there, but they seem to be out of balance. So yes, the intellectual development of young people, but where are we looking at in terms of their emotional development? Where are we looking at in terms of the physical development, creative development? So there's something about rebalancing that I think we need to look at. I think there's something around long-term disadvantage that we haven't really got a chance to look at. But when we look at our system, if there's a problem we're trying to solve, those pupils who have been long-term disadvantaged, 80% of their school life or more is key. I think there's something particularly coming out of oracy, out of the pandemic, for early years children that we need to look at, because if we don't capture that, then I think later on in terms of development of literacy and access to the curriculum, to the world of work, I think that's going to be damaged. And I think there are a series of things around the kind of the social issues. You look at everyone's invited, and whilst that was an issue that went beyond schools, there's a responsibility for schools in there. And just what was odd was Ofsted, who were supposed to be looking at this, were asked to review it. That was bizarre, because there needed to be something far wider than that. And so there's something about our accountability system that we might need to look at, and unpicking some of the accountability issues means that we won't have this really cliff-edged driver, which is single-minded, which is basically about exam results.
Okay, thank you, Stephen. Alex, can I ask, I mean, I get there's a specific thing I often worry about, which is employers in particular and work readiness. Do you think what in your mind, what's the thing that we could do to help on that in particular?
Do you know, there's the one phrase that sticks with me from all of the contributors over the last kind of 10 minutes or so, is the lady who runs Bounce Forward, and I think she talked about the focus on healthy minds. And I just feel like if we were to refocus the kind of education system on that, I mean, that is what, that is just so incredibly important for individuals, for our society, and, not even kind of in the world of work, but actually how are we recentering all of this kind of things and building, confident young people with healthy minds. And then when it comes to kind of the employment side of things, it's not education's job to get people ready for a specific job. It's not the employer's job, it's everybody. But I genuinely do think that those individuals which have a sense of self and a confidence and an ability to understand their self-worth will thrive in whichever environment it is. So that for me is the kind of critical thing that we really, really need to focus on, especially post-pandemic, especially post of those, which is actually creating young people, competent young people with healthy minds.
Thank you ever so much. And Aliyah, to finish, as you started us, what do you think, what do you take away from this? What do you want people to leave here thinking they need to do, apart from contributing to BigChange's big education conversation?
I think there's a somewhat agreement and consensus that the education system that we currently have is centered around like individualism and competition and a really like narrow academic achievement. And so moving away from that, I think it just starts with asking yourself, whoever you are, whatever role or position you play in the world, what do you want? What do you want for young people? What do you wish you wanted? And then beginning to make sure that we're actually being really connected in that mission and we're not doing it alone. And so as a young person, am I working with my teachers, with my senior leaders, with policymakers? What role do I have to play in making sure that we can all begin to reimagine education and continue the conversation? Because it needs to be more than just today's talk. It needs to be more than the Zooms that we've been doing over lockdown. It really needs to be action. And I just think it just starts with action and in the classroom. So when you go back to school tomorrow or Monday, what small actions can you be doing in order to change the culture of school that is simply not working for students?
Can I ask, Aliyah, you're leaving school now imminently. Are you going to keep going with pupil advocacy on behalf of school-age people? Do you have a succession plan?
Absolutely. So yeah, I've left education now. I am going to study education policy and international development at Cambridge next year. So my love and passion for education will continue, but Pupil Power, has students from as low as year 7 all the way up into university. Learning is lifelong, right? We all are involved in education and learning in some way, shape or form. And so I think it's, I still have a role to play, but I definitely am always going to be centering other young people as I get older and,
I didn't ask what you were going to, what you would do to the education system if you became Empress, Aliyah, because I'm slightly worried it's going to happen. So anyway, thank you ever so much, all of you. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you to everyone who spoke. Our next session is starting in 4 minutes. It's about how worried would he be about lost school time. My colleague Liz Mosley is going to take it over, and it's a really remarkable panel. I'm really looking forward to watching this one and being able to actually stop talking for a while. So thank you ever so much for joining us, and we'll see you in 4 minutes.